as we saw yesterday, the American exceptionalist view is very much the view of white men, generally speaking, or at least those in American history who've been highly successful and who've profited from the opportunities that the country has provided to them. So exceptionalists tend to be people who view America in triumphant terms. There are a lot of people, however, perhaps even the majority of Americans, that would question this view of America, or at least want to put it in different terms. So African Americans, for example, would rightfully look at exceptionalism as completely ignoring their historical experience for the majority of them. It doesn't speak to the suffering, the slavery, the institutional oppression, the racism, the rejection of poor people, the economic inequities. These do not speak to American greatness. So there are many Americans that would look at exceptionalism and say, this is a simple mythology that's being put forth by white people to try and suggest how great they are, but doesn't speak to the broader American experience. So if you go back and look at Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist before the Civil War, he was an enslaved man who escaped his condition, and then became a major spokesman for the abolitionist movement, for the rejection of slavery. If you look at this passage that you read last night for homework, this idea of the July 4th celebration being a sham, this whole idea of the shouts for liberty and equality being mockery of the fraud, deception, and hypocrisy. He's just calling white people out on the fact that they are ignoring the reality for huge numbers of Black people in the country. And he speaks powerfully, as does James Baldwin, who more succinctly says, when he looks at the Statue of Liberty, for a Black American, the Statue of Liberty is simply a very bitter joke, meaning nothing to us. This is a white person's statue. This is a statue for white immigrants. This is not a statue that speaks to Black people at all, because at the time that it was built, it was a time of tremendous oppression of Black people. The institution of slavery gets ignored under exceptionalism. This whole presentation of slavery in happy terms, this is all the way up to 2020. The smiling faces on your rice and on your maple syrup of servants or slaves is this idea that somehow Black servitude was something that was, to be enjoyed or appreciated. It's really subversive. Whereas the reality of the Black experience is much closer to the right. The destruction of families, cultural destruction, the rape, the systematic oppression. This is not part of what is an exceptionalism. And we'll go into this tomorrow, but everything from stealing Black labor, as happened under slavery and sharecropping, the policies that put Black people into poor neighborhoods, the use of prison labor by disproportionately Black people, segregation of schools, all of these things don't speak to greatness, they speak to oppression. Women also in the 19th century questioned this as they looked at their rights. They quoted Jefferson, but said, these rights don't apply to us. So they revolted based on some of Jefferson's ideas. Same thing for Native Americans. If you look at Massachusetts, a state named after a Native American tribe that has since gone extinct because of both disease and wars against them. It's kind of ironic. We live in a state that's named after an Indian tribe that we persecuted to extinction. You look at the tribes of the United States, these Native Americans, if they were told that the history of what happened to them, which was an atrocity, was somehow a great thing, they would laugh justifiably in that person's face. So this isn't greatness at all. This is just a history of tremendous abuse of power. So again, the killing of Native Americans in the 1890s, some of this can be seen in statements like this, right? Homeland Security fighting terrorism since 1492. What's the terrorism? It's the American people. It's the American nation, the white people that took over their land and their country brutally. For Latinos, it's the same thing. Large parts of what was previously Mexico, basically the entire southwestern part of our country, was stolen in a war that was basically fought over false pretenses, basically as a land grab. And of course, for Mexican and Latino immigrants that head north, many of them are just heading to land that used to be theirs if they're Mexicans, right? This is still their homeland. And so this idea that somehow they're doing something wrong speaks to the injustices of the country. So again, the use of Latino people for agricultural labor, the exploitation of those people. Cesar Chavez talks about this idea of the country is selfish, and we take advantage of working class people for the sake of wanting cheap grapes in our supermarkets. So what I'm going to ask you to do here is I want you to think about, I've mentioned this already, but what would Black people and people of color say about American exceptionalism? What does it ignore? Same thing for Native Americans. What does it ignore? And the same thing for women. So think about all those things. And then what I want you to do is think about what the implications of these things are. And we'll talk about this in class, but if you're working on this on your own, you might also write a little bit to get yourself ready.